Hello, I'm Mr. Wilson, and you may think that this is a Celestron 8SE, but it's actually not. It's the older version, the Celestron Nexstar 8i Special Edition. Now, if you've got one of these, I recommend that you hang on to it. It's actually a little bit better than the newer SE version. Now, what makes it better is that the motors in the mount are much smoother and just all around nicer than in the newer version. One of the advantages that the newer version does have over this older telescope, however, is that the newer version has a dovetail bar on here that allows you to actually remove the optical tube assembly, or OTA, and that allows you to then put the telescope on another mount if you want. This telescope, the older version, doesn't offer that capability. The mount and the OTA are permanently fused together. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to disassemble the mount and the telescope, and then we're going to modify it. I've purchased a dovetail bar here and a shoe, which we are going to attach to the mount. And the idea here is that this will allow us to remove the OTA and put it on another mount. Now, you may ask yourself, well, you just said that this was a really good mount, so why would I want to remove the OTA at all? And the answer is, you might not. I have used this telescope in this configuration for many years, and I am very pleased with it. The only reason that I'm wanting to remove the OTA at all is that as I'm getting more into astrophotography, I'm finding that this mount has limitations in that regard. As I'm piling heavier equipment and cameras and so forth onto this thing, I'm finding that the motors are having a little bit of a hard time keeping up with that increased payload. Also, you can see that there's not a lot of room between the bottom of the telescope and the bottom of the top of the mount. So when the telescope is pointed straight up like this, I don't have enough room under here for my camera. So the solution has been to put this on a wedge, which tilts the entire telescope at an angle, and that allows me to get longer exposures. However, that in itself does have some limitations. So I've kind of outgrown this mount for astrophotography purposes, and I want to get a larger, heavier, more powerful mount, one that is called an equatorial mount. This type of mount is called an alt-az mount. Now, you can do some astrophotography with this, and you can get some pretty good results. And you can get even better results if you put it on a wedge, and I will be talking about those things in later videos. But for long exposure astrophotography, you really do need that equatorial mount. And plus, you get the advantages of the increased payload with some counterweights and things like that. So, also, one of the things that makes this mount really nice is the fact that it is so compact and lightweight. That makes it ideal for things like star parties. If you just want to show some people some cool stuff in space, this is the mount you want to bring along. It's perfect for that sort of thing. But if you're doing long exposure astrophotography, we're going to want to swap it out. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to add the dovetail bar, or I'm going to show you how to break the telescope. I've never done this before, and I've really got my fingers crossed that we're going to be successful here, but we are going to have to figure it out. Now, I have been able to do some research into how to do something similar to this on a website called, I believe it's called nexstarsite.com. I'm not sure about that. I'll put the link in the description for you. I should also mention the dovetail bar and shoe I got from a website called admaccessories.com. admaccessories.com. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. So we're going to disassemble this telescope. We're going to figure out a way to put the dovetail bar on here, and hopefully we'll be successful. The secret to removing the OTA from the mount is hidden behind the controller. So we're going to start by removing that and kind of getting it out of the way. Inside of here, you will see 3 screws. There's a little screw right there, a little screw right there, and one at the top. Let me see if I can shed a little bit more light on this for you. There we go. 3 screws right there. We're going to start by removing those 3 screws, and that will expose a large nut underneath. So let's go ahead and remove those screws. All right, these screws are removed. I actually recommend that you do this laying down. I have actually already removed the OTA from this mount once before, and the first time I did it, I laid the unit down on the ground. I only have it standing up here for the purpose of creating this video. The reason I recommend that you lay this down is you don't want those screws to accidentally drop down inside of this little pocket. They might be difficult to retrieve in there. Another thing to note is that these screws are not ferromagnetic, so they won't stick to a magnet. So if you do drop one, a magnet's not going to help you out. You're just going to have to fish them out yourself. And the last thing you want to do is accidentally drop one inside of this mechanism. You then have to remove the entire, I don't even know how to do that, and it would scare me. So don't drop those screws. That's very important. Here is that big nut that I was telling you about. Now, the website that I shared with you that was giving me some hints on how to remove this thing recommended, and this is a good idea, to put a little mark. I don't know if you can see that. With a Sharpie, I just drew a little line on the nut and a matching line on the end of the bolt right there. The reason is that this is it is torqued a certain amount that will, so that you can move the OTA by hand. It will slip, but at the same time it's got enough friction that that the motors can still drive it. So you want to be able to torque that nut back onto the bolt without over tightening it or without under tightening it. So the website recommended if you put a little line there, then when you loosen it up, you'll be able to turn it the same number of turns to get it back to where it was before. Now, what I discovered with this is that that gets you close, but it still was a little bit off with me. And so I recommend that before you take this apart, grab the telescope and get a feel for what it feels like to move it back and forth. And you may need to adjust that nut a little bit more past or before the line. Now, this is a big nut, so I'm going to use a big wrench for it. The only wrench that I have that is compatible with this is going to be this crescent wrench. So I'm just going to pop that on there and do my best to loosen it. I must advise you, when you remove that nut, the OTA will no longer be attached to the mount. It is distinctly possible that you might drop the OTA. This is another reason that you want to lay it down on the ground to remove that nut. Now, as I have mentioned, I've actually already removed it, and it's currently only being held by a screw at the very top of the mount up here. At the top, there it is. Mine's only being held on here. You might say, well, why don't I just remove that screw, and why do I have to do all this stuff with this thing down here? There are two more screws that are at the bottom of the mount down here that are just not accessible. You just have to remove that thing to get access to those two bottom screws. So for the purpose of this video, I am going to remove my one screw that I have at top, and I'm going to remove my OTA so that I don't drop it. Now, you obviously won't be able to do that with yours if it's permanently attached, so lay it on the ground. Lay it on the ground so that you don't drop it, okay? I've got mine upright only for this video. So I'm going to remove my screw and remove the OTA and then show you how to remove the rest of the thing, because I do still need to have it off of the mount to be able to do the rest of this project. So let's remove that top screw. Okay, I have removed the OTA for the purposes of this video. We're going to go ahead and continue removing its mount. This is what you would do with it laying down on the ground. So we have to remove that nut inside of there. So let's just go ahead and get after it. The first time that I removed this nut, it was actually quite difficult to remove. So you can see that I don't know if you can see it or not, but I did mar up those nuts that nut a little bit trying to get it off. It's a little bit looser now. I think it had some kind of Loctite or something on there. Now here, let's take a look. Let's zoom in there a little bit more. All right. Here's the thing. This is another reason you want to do this with it laying down. When I remove this, there are a series of washers in there, and just like with the screws, we don't want those washers to fall down inside of this thing. They're quite large. I don't know if they would fit down there or not, but still, lay it down so that you don't lose them. I've only got this upright for the purpose of this video. I'm going to take the nut off very carefully so I don't lose my washers. Now you want to take note of the order of the washers. There's 3 different things inside of here. You want to take note of the order of each and the orientation. This first one, for my telescope, it might be different for yours, so write it down, take some pictures or something. This first washer is somewhat cone shaped. So here, as I take this out, it's got a little bit of a cone shape to it, and the pointy part of the cone faces out. So what I'm going to do is I want to write that down or take a picture of it or something, because it needs to go back exactly in the same order, facing the same direction and all of that. All right, so there's my first one. The next one is a flat washer that protects the bearings. Let's go ahead and remove that one. I'm going to use a little flathead screwdriver here just to kind of get in the corners a little bit to help me pop that guy out. All right, that is just a normal flat washer. There's nothing, it's not cone shaped or anything special. It is a bit greasier on the one side that faces the bearing, so I want to put that greased side back on there when I'm done. Now we have exposed the bearings. When I first did this, I just about lost my mind. I was afraid that all those little bearings were going to just come rolling out of there, but it actually does appear to be fixed in there. I don't recommend manhandling it. They might pop out, but yeah, we're just going to pop that entire thing out just like we just did with that washer. Bearings are out. Okay, at this point we have removed the 3 washers, and we can now pull the telescope and its existing bar apart. Now that those washers and the nut have been removed, all I have to do is just push the entire thing in that direction and it will slide right out. Again, if we had this laying down so that we don't drop the telescope which is attached. It's a little bit easier for me now simply because the telescope is not attached. But here, if I just kind of wiggle it back and forth a little bit, it'll pop right out. Now here's what I want to show you. On the other side of this, there's going to be some more parts. So let's zoom in and see what the other side looks like. On this side, there is a few other things we're going to want to know. So I'm just kind of wiggling and rocking that to get that to just pull straight out. Okay, it is now released. So again, we will want to lay this down so that we don't drop all the parts, but here is what we are looking at. There is a silver gear inside of here that meshes with a small gear down here. This small gear is attached to the motor. You can see that there's a nylon bushing right here, and there are 2 matching nylon bushings right there. Those nylon washers fit inside of this recessed area on the silver gear. They are only sticking to this part because they are greased, so be careful. Yet another reason to do this laying down on the ground so that those little washers don't fall inside of the unit. So here I'm just going to pull them off. They were only stuck on with grease. I'm going to put them back inside of here. Now, as I remove this gear, you can see there is a black disc inside of here, and it's made of, I don't know, like felt or something. this is what provides the friction that allows you to move this with your hand without having to grind the gears and so forth. So when you put this back together, you want to make sure that that black disc touches the polished, ungreased thing here. It's important that you don't put any grease or anything on this disc. So if you've got greasy fingers like I do, we're going to want to wipe those off before we touch the disc too much. We want to keep that nice and dry. Now the first time that I did this, I'll admit it was a little bit scary. I'm taking apart my telescope and I really don't know what I'm doing. So hopefully those tips will help you out to get this far. From here on out, I have no instructions. I don't know exactly how to do this. I've bought the parts that I think I need, but how to get them all to talk to each other, we're just going to have to experiment. So let's see if we can do it. I'm hoping that this first part is relatively straightforward. The place where you removed the original mount, it had 3 screws, one here, and 2 here, and 1 here. So the Dovetail bar that I've got is made for the SE version of this telescope, and my understanding is that it has the same mounting system. So this should be a simple matter of the bar is made for this, so it should fit. Famous last words. So I have a little unboxing here as well. Let's go ahead and cut open the package on this Dovetail bar and we'll see what it comes with. We've got the bar itself, some mounting hardware. So the first thing that I notice is that this one has 1 hole in it. Find the focal point. There it is. That one has 1 hole in it, and this one has 2. So the 2 is going to match the 2 holes on the back, and the 1 is going to match the 1 hole on the front. This one that goes on the front, it only has the 1 hole in it, right? And it's not threaded. See how I can just push that bolt right through. So the idea here is that we would push that all the way through the front. I'm going to take the end of our dovetail bar. We're going to put that little mounting plate right there. Put that screw all the way in. The screw goes all the way through out the other side. So none of this is threaded, so if I let it go, that screw and stuff is just going to fall right out. Now, how do we fix that? The thread is in the front of the telescope. So right here, that's what we're going to screw it into, and that's what's going to hold it. The back, that little mounting plate has a 3rd hole right there in the middle, and that one is tapped. So that one does have threads. We'll be able to attach it. But since this one is the loose one, that's the one we're going to attach first. So what I'm going to do here is just sort of start it, but it's just enough to get it to hold in place. Now I'm going to take the one on the back and we're going to find its home too. The bar is now attached, but everything's still kind of loose. So what I want to do is just make sure that I square everything up. I don't know how exact this has to be, but there are some slats in this back one that will allow me to move it left and right a little bit, and I'm just going to try to make sure that this is as square as I can get it. I want to take this compound square, I'm going to butt it right up against the flat part of the back of the telescope. I'm just going to angle that until the ruler makes contact with the dovetail bar, and I'm going to wiggle that back and forth until the ruler, there's no gap between the ruler and the dovetail bar. Let's see if I can get a little bit more light so you can see that better. So there's no gap between the ruler and the dovetail bar. So that's how I know that it is should be at least square enough for our purposes. Now I can go ahead and tighten it all down. That is all tight, and it looks pretty good. Now I should mention that on the ADM Accessories website This Dovetail Bar is available in a variety of sizes. I opted to get the extra long version, so if you're not liking the aesthetics of how that's hanging off of there, they've got a version that will work for you. They got one that'll fit exactly in that space if you want it. The reason that I wanted the extra long version is because the mount is the factory mount is designed to clip onto the back of the scope right about here. So I had all that extra weight from my camera and stuff on the back, and so I wanted to be able to shift more of the weight into this direction, and the way we're going to do that is by sliding the entire scope forward, and by buying the extra long mount it gave me a little bit of extra space here. The idea, at least this is what I'm thinking, again I've never done this before, is that by sliding the entire telescope forward, that will make the front of the telescope a little bit heavier, like a fulcrum, and but that extra weight on the back of the telescope will compensate for it. At least that's the idea. So that's the reason I got the extra long version. Your results may vary and you may not like that. You may not have a need for it, so there's others available. Now for the tricky part. The Dovetail Bar is a kit that is made for this type of telescope. So it came with all the necessary hardware, all the screw holes were in all the right places. It just worked. This shoe is made for any kind of generic accessory. It's not necessarily made for this telescope. It didn't come with any mounting hardware or screws or anything. And there is no place to put something like this. Like I said, this telescope wasn't designed to be removed from its mount. So this is where we're going to have to start custom fabricating some things and just figuring out how exactly to make this with that mount. So here's my thoughts on this. This is the original bar that came with the telescope. We still have to use this. It's the thing that has the bolt and stuff. So I'm going to mount this back on the mount, and that big gear and that felt pad and all that stuff has to go back on here. The question is, where do I attach the new mounting bracket thing? My first inclination was to just mount it right there. Since this is the point of rotation, this is where the motor is going to be doing all of its work, and since the front of the telescope weighs a lot less than what I've got on the back with the mirror and the camera and everything on the back of the telescope, this thing's really going to be back heavy. So it makes sense to mount this as far back on the camera as on the mount as I can. The problem is I can't drill into this. If I put a bunch of bolts through the shoe and into this plate, then they're going to interfere with the gear and stuff that's inside of here. So I can't do that. So my next thought was, well, I've got a number of holes on this plate that I can use. I can just shift it forward because there's nothing on this bar that's going to cause me any trouble. So I'll just mount the entire thing in the front here. But the more I thought about that, the more I didn't like that idea. If we have to, that's what we'll do. But I want to try something else first. I could just drill a couple of holes right through this and tap them and just put in some screws, and it would just sit there like this, and that'd be just fine. The problem is that now all of the weight of the telescope is now really hanging on the front of this bar, and so that's really going to it's going to apply a significant torque to this motor back here. So we were talking about that fulcrum before. By if the middle of this thing is the fulcrum, and then if I am now applying even a small force here, it's going to translate to a bigger force on the opposite end, since this thing is not balanced. So I thought by hanging all of the weight of the telescope on the front, that is really going to cause the motor some trouble, and it's really going to pull that down. So I really do want to mount this as far back as I can to get that weight right over that motor. So the solution that I came up with I bought this long aluminum bar at the hardware store, and I'm thinking that I'm just going to obviously cut it shorter. It doesn't need to be this long. I can drill a nice little hole right there in the middle to attach this bar on the other side, and then I'll just use the existing hole that's already there, drill through that and tap it so that this metal bar sits on there. From there, I should be able to drill holes anywhere in this metal bar that I want, and I won't have to worry about my screws interfering with the gear and stuff that's on the back. So the first order of business, I have to trim this bar. It is far too long, so what I've done is I've just taken my the manufacturer's plate. I'm going to line it up with the back of my bar here, and I'm just going to, with a Sharpie, mark a line. What can I say? I was really hoping for some cool sparks on that one, but I guess it just wasn't in the cards. So I've finished cutting the bar, and I went ahead and filed the edge down just to remove some of the burrs. And now what we're going to do is we're going to attach the bar to the original mounting bracket that came with the telescope. So what I've got here is a 1/4 by 20 bolt, and that happens to fit perfectly inside of the hole that's already in this bar. So here you can see right there, we can just pop that guy right through there. So what I'm going to do is drill a corresponding hole in this bar, and I'm going to actually tap that. So I'm going to put some threads into it so that I don't need a bolt on the other side, and then I'll just screw that guy right into the metal bar. Now on the other side, in the middle of this, I have 2 holes that were already here. I'm going to need to make another hole right there in the middle, a 1/4 inch wide, so that the screw can go through that, and then I'll do the same thing on this end. I'll drill a hole in there and tap it. Now the thing to keep in mind when you're tapping a hole is that it needs to be a little bit smaller than the shaft of the bolt that you're putting into it. So this is a 1/4 inch bolt, so my hole will need to be a little bit smaller, and I've got a little chart that's going to tell me how big those need to be. So let's go ahead and start by drilling the hole right in the middle of those 2 stock holes. All right, according to our handy dandy reference chart, to tap a hole for a 1/4 inch bolt, we need a hole that is 0.2010 inches. So that, in terms of fractions, is going to get us right here. 201 is what we're looking for. The closest drill bit I've got is a 13/64. So I'm going to use a 13/64 inch drill bit to drill the hole into the aluminum bar, and that will allow me to tap it with those threads. Now in the stock bar that came with the telescope, I'm going to drill a full 1/4 inch hole in that because I do not want to tap those threads. I want to make sure that the hole that I make in the factory bracket exactly lines up with the hole that I make in the aluminum bar that I'm adding. So the best way to do that is to drill through both at the same time. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and clamped them together. I've tried to line up the aluminum bar as perfectly straight as I can, all the way down the entire length of it. So this is totally parallel with the original bracket. I don't want there to be any discrepancies in that. I put a little piece of tape on this end, and I put a couple of little marks, you probably can't see them there, just to indicate where the metal bar is, and then a little dot right there in the middle to indicate where I want that hole to go. Now if you've ever drilled
through metal before, or most materials, your bit might start to wander off of that little target dot. So what I want to do first of all is hit it with the punch. So here, this is just a pointy metal thing, and you stick it on where you want your dot to be. You whack it with the hammer, it puts a little dent in the metal, and that will help prevent the bit from walking off. So I'm just going to set this here, give it just a little tap, and I think that's probably a good enough dent to prevent the bit from walking, hopefully anyway. The other thing you might notice here is that the bottom of this bracket isn't flat. It's got these little tabs here, and so those little tabs are preventing this whole thing from sitting flat on my drill press. So what I've got is a little expendable piece of wood here, and that's going to allow me to kind of press this down and hold it there so that the basically my piece of wood is not resting against those little tabs, so that the entire assembly will fit flat on the drill press table. So let's go ahead and give it a go. We'll fire it up and drill this hole through both the factory bracket and the new metal bar that I'm adding. You can see that hole went straight through the factory bracket and straight through the aluminum bar I'm adding on the other side too. It's not exactly center, but I'll take it, that's good enough. Now we have to do the same thing on this side. So I already have the factory hole that's already drilled there. I want to try as best I can to get that a smaller hole centered exactly in the factory hole. And remember, we are using the smaller bit here because we want to make sure that we have enough material to tap it. So once again, I'm going to put this right in the middle of the factory hole, give it a tap. So now that I have got both of my holes drilled, the hole that's in the factory mount back here, I need to make that a full 1/4 of an inch, but I do not want that to make the aluminum one larger. So I'm actually going to remove my clamp and remove my aluminum bar. And before I mix this up, I notice whenever I drill holes like this, they line up that way, and if I were to accidentally flip the bar around, they're not going to line up anymore. So what I'm going to do is actually mark this so that I don't mix up the orientation. So all I've done is just drawn a little picture to remind me which direction this goes, so I don't accidentally turn it upside down, so I don't actually turn it the wrong way like this. Otherwise my holes aren't going to line up. So let's go ahead and drill out that hole on the back, this time using the larger drill bit. And we can go ahead and test fit that with our little screw that we're going to put in there, and that guy just drops in there perfectly. That's exactly what we want, just like on the other side, just drops in perfect like that. Now what we're going to do is now tap the smaller holes that we made in the metal bar. We're going to add some threads to those. So let's do that next. I've loaded in my 1/4 20 tap, and we're just going to put that exactly center in our hole, and we're going to slowly and carefully try to bore that right straight in. Do want to make sure that we're not going in at a weird angle or anything, and nice and slow is the way to go with this. It's also not a bad idea to use some cutting oil or something with this as well. As a matter of fact, I am going to do that. clear the chips out of the cutting threads and do the same thing on the other side. We'll just take our screw, we'll thread it right into that hole right there, and we'll just test it out. That is a perfect fit. Now that my holes are drilled and tapped and everything is lining up properly, I've got my little note on here to remind me which hole lines up in which way, and I can see that they are lining up perfectly. What I'm gonna do now is I'm just going to attach these. Now, ultimately, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna add a little bit of thread locker on there so that those guys do not move around on me. But I'm not gonna do that just yet because I still need to mount the saddle to this aluminum bar that we just created. And we're not, I'm gonna have to remove this again in order to drill those holes. But before I do that, I just wanna line everything up and make sure I know where I'm going to be drilling those holes. So we can go ahead and attach this. We can see it is now fixed on there beautifully. And let's go ahead and figure out where we want to mount the saddle. I do want those holes to be right in the middle of my aluminum bar that I've created here. The problem is that the bolts, when they go all the way through here, are going to stick out. So those did not have the proper sized bolts, so I'm going to have to cut off the excess length. That is going to mess up the threads, and so what I'm going to have to do is recut those threads. So I have a die that's going to let me do that. It's basically the opposite of tapping. We're going to use a die for that. Now, according to the manufacturer of this bracket, I needed to get 5/16 by 18 button head bolts. So I managed to find at least that, and those fit perfectly in there. You can see that they don't, they sit nice and flush with the top of that when they're seated. So that's a really nice fit. But again, they are too long. They're going to stick. They're going to go all the way through the metal bar and then keep going. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drill the holes through the bar. I'm actually going to drill them with this in place so that I actually drill the holes into the factory bracket as well. That's going to give me a little extra depth. You can see how it's got these radial spokes that stick out. Well, there's a spoke that goes right down the middle. So when I drill through this, I'm actually going to drill through that spoke too. The spoke isn't fat enough to accommodate a hole, so it's actually going to blow out the sides of that spoke, but I will still be able to thread it a little bit, and that'll give me just a little bit of extra material, a little extra grippiness on there. So let's go ahead and mark where we want those holes to be. We'll hit it with the punch to put in a couple of little dents, and then we'll drill those out. What size drill bit do I need to use for a 5/16 inch hole? And now remember, we're going to be threading that, so I can't just use a 5/16. That won't give me enough material to cut the teeth. So it actually has to be a little bit smaller than 5/16, and that is where the chart comes in. Now, according to the chart, to tap a hole for a 5/16 18 bolts, that means I need to drill a hole that is 0.2570 inches, and that is pretty darn close to a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to use a 1/4 inch there. If I find that hole is a little too small, if it's a little too hard to get the tap in there, then I could bump it up to 17/64. But we're going to go ahead and start with a 1/4, because you can always make a hole bigger, but you can't make it smaller. Just like before, we're going to go ahead and tap those holes, a little bit of oil there, just to make it a little easier. Now I have swapped out the tap on this for the 5/16 inch 18. Find the best way to do this is to keep your head moving. Like, look at it from this angle and then look at it from this angle to make sure that it's not going in crooked from either direction, and you want to keep watching that. There's nothing worse than getting a screw that goes in cattywampus. It turns out that the radial spoke did not go all the way through to this side, so that one didn't hit it, but the front one did. So I'm not going to be able to tap this in all the way into that spoke because I didn't drill all the way through this plate. I don't want to damage the things that are the gears and stuff that are on the other side of this plate, or rather the gears that will be on the other side. So I'm just going to primarily focus on getting through the aluminum bar and going in as deep as I can before the tap bottoms out in my hole. All right, I can feel it and see that the tap has now bottomed out in the bottom of the hole that I drilled, so it's time to start backing it out. What I've done here is I've gone ahead and put in my screws. Because that spoke didn't go through on this side, that gave me plenty of room, and that bolt went all the way in. I didn't have to trim it down at all, so that's good news. But you can see that the bolt on this side is quite proud. So it is sticking up quite a bit from the nice flush mount that we've got on the other side. So the question is, how much? How much is that sticking up? I'm going to have to cut that amount off of the threaded side. So to figure out what that depth is, I'm going to use my caliper here, and specifically going to use the back end of the caliper. If you've ever used one of these before, we're quite accustomed to measuring the width of a shaft or something like this with that, or you can measure the size of a hole with the other side, but you can also measure the depth of holes and other things by putting that little peg inside your hole. So you can see that when I've zeroed the caliper out, that the other side, that little peg doesn't extend at all. But as I open the caliper up, that little peg starts to come out, and I can put that in my holes to find out how deep holes are and stuff. So as I bring that peg down until it makes contact with the saddle, that is the amount that I'm going to need to remove. And according to my caliper, it's 33/128ths of an inch. That is an extremely precise value. So what I'm going to do is just lock the caliper in this position, and then just use the peg there as my guide. Okay, I have removed that bolt, and now what I'm going to do is put the little tail of my caliper right up against it and see how far down I have to go. So it looks like I'm going to have to cut at least to this thread, so I'm going to go ahead and make a mark. Now that is going to definitely mess up the threads of that bolt, so I'm going to have to recut those threads when I'm all done. Now, I can't tell you how much I hate cutting bolts. I just haven't found the best way to do this yet. I think what I'm going to do is cut it right there where my mark is, and then maybe clean it up with a file or maybe the bench grinder or something. I'm just going to try the hacksaw first. If this isn't working, I might just use the bench grinder and grind it all the way down. All right, I have finished cutting that off. I'm going to use a hand file just to kind of clean up the edges a little bit. I want to try not to use the bench grinder. It's actually kind of late. I don't want to disturb my neighbors. So let's see if I can get away with using just this. Now we're going to put the die on it and recut the threads. All right, if you've never done anything like this before, a die, it works basically the same way as a tap does, but in reverse. You got these different little, these are the actual dies, and they come in different sizes, different thread pitches and stuff. So I've got the proper one in here, a 5/16 18. And you do have to start it from the right side. If you start it backwards, it actually has printed on there, start from the other side. So we're gonna start like this, and I'm gonna try and line it up as best I can with the existing threads, and we're just gonna turn it on the bolt to recut those threads that were damaged. So let's see if I can do this properly. Oh, it just went right on there, nice. Maybe it wasn't too damaged after all. Cool. Just make sure it's nice all the way on there. That wasn't bad at all. Okay, that just went right on. All right, let's go ahead and put it back on our shoe then and see if it works. So what I've done is I went ahead and screwed that screw back in, and it came out perfectly. That never happened, so I'm very pleased with that. So what I'm gonna do now is take out all 4 of these 2 here, as well as the 2 that I put in on the other side, and we're going to apply a little bit of thread locker and screw them back in. If you've never used it before, thread locker, this is Loctite thread locker. It's this liquid, and when you screw things in, it hardens and prevents those bolts and things from rattling out. So anytime you have things that are moving around, you want to make sure that those bolts don't get loose on you over time. Thread locker is the way to go. They make blue and red. The blue one is not permanent, so if I ever needed to, I'd be able to remove these bolts. And then the red one is permanent. I never like anything to be permanent because, as you can see, I always like to go back and modify things later. So I'm going to be using the blue Loctite to hold it in place and screw it all back together again. Here is the final assembly. All of the screws are reattached. Everything is in place. The thread locker is ready to go. The only thing left is to reassemble the mount. So what we're going to do is we're going to put that little felt pad on first, and then we're going to put all of the felt pad, the big gear, we'll put it back onto the base, we'll put all of the little, the bearings and the washers and all the stuff back in the same exact order that we took it off. So first of all, I'm gonna make sure that this plate right here is nice and clean. I don't have any sawdust or metal chips or any other contaminants from me working on it. That is nice and clean. Remember, this plate doesn't get any grease or anything. Then we put the felt pad on top of that, just like so. Then we're going to put the large gear on top of the felt pad. Make sure everything's nice and centered. Drop that right in place. Now remember, the gear has those little recessed areas for those neoprene washers, or nylon washers rather, and there's a track inside here that those washers need to ride in. So when I put this back in place, I want to make sure that those little washers ride in that track. And I think the best way to do this is probably to lay it down. Maybe I'll put the track in first. Let's try that. All right, so I'm just trying the reverse. I'm putting the, making sure the washers are riding in their track, putting the gear in there, and then I'm going to put the bracket in on top of that. Feels like it's moving nice and smooth. Doesn't feel like anything is mucked up at all, so that is good. All right, so now we got to put the bearings on next. So I've got all my little goodies here. Gonna go ahead and put the bearings in next, just like that. There we go. Now I'm going to put this large washer in. You'll recall that was the next step. I'm putting the side with the most grease toward the bearings. And then this last washer, remember this is the one that is like cone shaped, and we wanted the peak of the cone to face out like that. There we go. All right, the last step is to put the big nut back on, and remember we had made some little marks on there so that we knew how far to twist it on. I'm just going to lay this down real quick to make sure that my little cone-shaped washer is right in the middle, and we'll go ahead and put that in place. Now, before I put this the cover plate back on, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to attach the telescope to it and just see if everything is looking okay. And then I'm actually going to move the telescope by hand. I've been using this telescope for many years, so I really have a good feel for what it feels like to move it by hand. And if I feel like it's too loose, then I might go ahead and tighten that nut up a little bit more. This really is the moment of truth. Did we do this right? All right, everything's on there. Just kind of giving it a once over, making sure nothing's loose or janky. That looks pretty good. I do notice it doesn't look like this is perfectly in line like it was before. I don't think that's going to cause a problem. When I calibrate the telescope, I tell it where the objects, the three bright stars are, and so it bases everything off of those positions. So I don't think that this discrepancy is going to mess with me. If it does, then this, I noticed this before I put it on, that the saddle was not quite square to the factory bracket here, so I had a feeling that this was going to be the outcome. The saddle has a total of 4 screws. Right now I'm only using 2, so if I needed to, I could remove one of those screws and re-drill it and readjust the bracket. And I could do that 2 more times if I needed to get it right. But I don't think it's going to cause me any trouble. So what I'm going to do is, it is nighttime. Like I said, it's actually quite late. I think I have a clear sky. So I'm going to take this out and see if I can still track some stars with it. And if everything looks good, I'll put the cover back on. Let's give it a feel. Feels a little loose. I'm going to go ahead and tighten that up just a little bit. Okay, so it looks like the telescope is working beautifully. I've got it tracking Mars right now. I've ran through the setup really quick and everything is working fantastic. I couldn't be happier with how this came out. So if you have one of these older telescopes and you want to put a Dovetail bar on it, you now know how to do it. Good luck.